Hey there, I'm Dan Brodsky. I've used my background in higher education and corporate training to help hundreds of folks take charge of their career. So here's what you can expect on this show. I sit down with another career expert to talk about topics designed to help you in the short and long-term parts of your career. Things like sharpening your resume and job searching, being an effective communicator, and sometimes just being more confident. So settle in, get cozy, and welcome to Career Focus. Really excited to be chatting with today's guest. This is someone that I met earlier this year. His name is Jez Benton. And Jez started as a connection of a connection. Over the last few months, though, he and I have gained a little bit more familiarity and excitement to get to know one another. And a little bit about him, he owns a learning, leadership, and culture change company called Canvas. And he also hosts a podcast called Route to the Top. Jez, our guest today, is a real mountain man. He has summited many of the world's most dangerous and obviously very beautiful mountains, including Mount Everest back in 2005. Jez is originally from the UK, but he's a dual citizen. He lives here in the US in Westport, Connecticut. For those of you that don't know where Westport is on a map, it is a little bit outside of New York City. Jez is a super bright, extremely kind and nice guy. And I am really excited to get to know him and his background a little bit further with you all today. So I want to give you, Jez, a warm welcome and thanks so much for being here on Career Focus.
Thanks, Dan. Happy to be here from, as you said, Westport, Connecticut. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a Tuesday night here right now where we're recording. What's a normal occurrence on a Tuesday night for you?
Well, I have 4 boys, twins who are nearly 16, a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, plus a dog and my wife. So usually at 7:30, it's a madhouse with people coming and going. But between camps, bit of travel, I've got an empty house. So it's great.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad I caught you on a good night. Thank you so much for being here. And Jez, I want to check on something real quick. I think your real name, your birth name is Jeremy. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right, yes.
So how did you get the nickname Jez?
It's an English thing. So what happens a lot in England with nicknames is they remove the back half of the name and put a Z on the end of it. So Barry becomes Baz, and Derek might become Des, and Dan might even become Daz.
Okay.
So I was actually on an expedition in Pakistan in 1995, big climbing expedition. We had myself as one of the expedition leaders with another leader, and then 18 young 17, 18-year-old climbers that we were leading. The other expedition's leader's name was Baz. Barry Roberts is his real name, but he was already known as Baz. So I turned up on this expedition with a bunch of teenagers, and they looked at me by day one and said, we can't have Jeremy and Baz as our expedition leaders. It's got to be Jez and Baz. And that was it. So it was August 1995, and it stuck. So what's that? 30 years later, everybody now knows me as Jez.
I love that. So obviously people that are listening, they can tell from your accent. I mentioned you're a dual citizen. Just take us back to the beginning. Geographically, where are you from?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the county of Norfolk, which if you look at a map of the UK, most people know London is in the southeast. If you drove for about 3 hours or 120 miles north and east out of London, you would hit Norfolk. Now, nobody's really heard of Norfolk. Not a lot happens there. No interstates into the county, so not many people travel there. Mm-hmm. So kind of quiet, rural county in England. So I lived there for the first 21, 22 years of my life before moving to London. But yeah, that's where I originate from. I'm trying to think of famous things from Norfolk, and there's a few that Americans might know. Coleman's mustard,
okay,
being one. Lotus sports cars being another one. Yeah, and that's pretty much it, really.
All right, mustard and sports cars.
Mustard, sports cars. And I guess you could say the royal family. The king has a Brigham, which is their summer residence, which is in the county of Norfolk. So
I'm sure there's probably a summer residence, a fall residence, a winter residence, and then a regular residence, huh?
Yes, probably.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking us back there. Jez, I want to dive in a little bit at what you do professionally on a daily basis. You run Canvas Leadership, but tell us a little bit about what Canvas is and ultimately what you do.
Yeah. So I've been, for the best part of the last, I'm trying to think, 25, 26 years, something like that, have been in the leadership development, team effectiveness, coaching space pretty much most of my career. I mean, early days, a lot of that professional climbing in the mountains and sort of outdoor education that morphed into corporate work, teams, leadership, etc. So Canvas it's coming up on 3.5 years. So it's a relatively new organization. And the business basically does four fundamental things. It works with executive teams around team effectiveness. So executive teams or senior teams. So last week, for example, I was with the executive team of Heineken, focused very much on their growth agenda for the next 5 years and how that leadership team is going to lead and drive that agenda. So that's our team kind of space. We do a lot of consulting around culture, whether that is changing a culture, integration of two companies that have merged together and looking at the culture of the two and bringing those together. The third area is leadership development programs. So working with large organizations, companies like Amgen, who's a biotech based out of California. We work with their top 320 leaders around developing the leadership that's required to take them through their next growth stage. And then the fourth area of work is executive coaching. So that's one-on-one coaching of those executives. So that's primarily what we do as a business. I think probably what's interesting is how we go about doing that that's different to most organizations. So we are very focused at Canvas on change and what is the compelling reason for individuals to change. So we have a bit of a belief that organizations don't change, people do. Because if actually you took all the people out of an organization, nothing would change, right? It would just sit there, nothing would happen. So it has to be infused with people. And it's those people changing that actually change the organization. So if you agree with that or not, if you wind that back, what you have to focus on is what's the compelling reason for the change in the first place? Why do anything differently? And my pharmaceuticals client will tell you that in the medical space, if you go to a doctor's and you are diagnosed with a life-threatening long-term illness or potential illness, and they prescribe you certain medication, 70% of the people will not continue to take that medication over the long term. For whatever reason, they don't adhere to the regime. And, the compelling reason to continue to do that is death. So if you think about that from how individuals and people might need to change within an organization, you need a pretty compelling reason to help people with that. So our work very much focuses on understanding what that compelling reason is and trying to motivate and help people find what's compelling for them to be able to make those changes. So that's part of our philosophy as a firm, and one that when you get to work with groups and you face them with, okay, so what is the compelling reason to change? They really struggle to answer. And it's about working a process through that. So yeah, we work globally. We work in Asia, we work in Europe. I would probably say 80% of our work is in the US with US-based clients. And we're a team of 65, 70 people, something like that. A lot of our facilitators and coaches are contract, but people, this is the bonus of being in this industry for 25 years. I know a lot of really good people who have built relationships over the last 25 years with excellent facilitators and coaches. And then internally, we do all the consulting, the design and development, client management with a full-time team. And I've done a little bit of everything. 25 years, I started off as a facilitator. I moved into client management for a while. I did a stint in sales for my sins for a few years just to get that felt out before moving into business management, etc. So the great thing about that is when I talk to clients, work with clients, I sort of have expertise in each of those areas. So I think the phrase is jack of all trades, which is what I tend to be, along with a large team on my side.
That's excellent that you all focus so much on working with executives or senior teams. Obviously, those are the people that are the movers and shakers of organizations. They ultimately put change in motion. And culture, that's such a broad term. And in order for me to understand how I need to adapt, it's important to understand the culture and the organization that I'm going into. A lot of that starts with the leadership development that you mentioned with previous clients or other existing clients. Are any of those managers on the front lines where they're managing people who are either entry level or kind of in the early career stages of their working life?
Many clients that we work with are managing those frontline staff. We work across all sorts of different organizations, from manufacturing to fast moving consumer goods. And I think tough job at the moment, and it leads to some of our culture change work as well. A sort of post COVID struggle that a lot of organizations have is, how do we effectively manage frontline? There's a lot going on there with, remote work, slightly different wants and needs from individual contributors in an organization, what they're looking for. Managers who just used to do things by the book and be very process orientated, a lot less effective these days. They've got to have that. We have a client that focuses on human centricity. They actually have to call out, we need our managers to be more human. I'm like, but they are human. Well, what are you talking about? They're not robots, but sometimes they act like them because they've been given so many systems and processes to follow. It becomes quite robotic. And we know that the work-life blending that's going on right now, it's not quite that simple. I mean, here I am sat at home, 7:30 at night, talking to you, having just stopped work, juggling a couple of kids. My wife and two others are away. All of that now is the daily norm, which it really wasn't pre-COVID.
Absolutely. Folks have different wants and needs now in their career compared to even just 5 years ago. My question to you is kind of a two-parter. The first part is, how can any manager clearly understand what their employees are motivated by? And if you are an employee trying to help your manager understand more about what you want, what is a way to advocate for yourself in a way that's going to lead to those positive changes and enablement of your own success?
First one first. For me, and this has always surprised me in the corporate world, and I guess I'm naive because I've never worked for an organization that has more than, 250 employees, something like that. So when you scale that up to, a company like JP Morgan that has 250,000 employees, you kind of have to temper what I'm saying through that lens. But this notion that you can manage people and not really know them always was a bit of a surprise to me. Other than what they do for you, you don't really know them. And that was true pre-COVID. And I think what COVID did was it broke down a lot of those barriers, right? Because all of a sudden you would see the husband walk behind you in a t-shirt and a pair of shorts, or, the kids leaning in to see who you're talking to. Or so it suddenly removed this barrier of, I don't actually need to know anything personal about you. Again, I can just follow the process and manage. And I think leaders got away, or managers got away with that for a long time. And now that's just not the case. So I don't even come at it from a millennial or Gen X or Z or whatever it might be about what they want and need, because I think that's a bit of a trap. It's a bit of a kind of, it's a different generation. We need to understand them and provide them with what they need. It's much more of a two-way street. And for me, it's, how do I have the people around me being as effective as they possibly can be? And if that means I have to get to know them as a person, then that's what I'm going to have to do, as opposed to I'm going to have to fill in some numbers on a performance grid and show it to them and hope they perform more. Then that's what you used to have to do. So that personalization, and it's hard work. That's a lot of social energy for managers when they're juggling a whole bunch of other things as well. But we see it in productivity. We see it in retention of individual contributors. The data is there to say, if you need to forge a personal relationship with those people, they'll stick around longer, they'll work harder, where they're coming from, when they're having a good day and a bad day, etc. So I think that's a bit of a different skill set for people. And I think a lot of managers that you meet say, well, it wasn't like that when I was here. I work with a private equity firm, and there's a lot of talk about mentoring the analysts. And they're like, oh, well, we didn't get mentored when we ran. We're told to work, 18 hours a day and learn as we went and da, da, da. The world has changed. That's not how it was. So those people that are kind of stuck in, they got to learn the same way I learned, starting to struggle with retaining the talent. So I think that's a big one for managers. For me, it's all about the conversations that you have with your people. And if it's all transactional, that will only get you so far. It needs to be transactional and relational. And that blend of those two things really helps managers manage the performance of their people and teams. On the flip side, from the sort of individual contributors within an organization, junior staff within an organization, I actually like this notion of what's the contract that I have with my boss and my boss has with me. And what I mean by that is, here's what I'm going to give and here's what I'm going to get. It's a kind of wants and needs. So, as me as the manager, if I need certain things, I can lay those out. But then what do you want from this? What experiences do you want? What levels of challenges do you want? And if you can match those two things, then that two-way work becomes fantastic. And get comfortable with not trying to hoard and hang on to talent. It might be like, for the next 3 years, here's our exchange. Reid Hoffman wrote a book about this. He was a little bit ahead of his time. What's the exchange? What am I going to get from you? And what are we going to give to you in return? And that's not just money, okay? And your output. That is a whole range of things. High on the list is obviously experiences and purposeful work.
Mm-hmm. When I think back, some of the jobs that I have enjoyed the most were not just because I enjoyed the work or maybe was good at it. It was also because I had a really great boss. There was one in particular, I had a supervisor that had an art history background, but we weren't doing that type of work at all. It had nothing to do with my sports management degree. My supervisor was great at just asking me, Dan, what do you want to do? In addition to that, how can I support you as a manager so that you get either the outcomes that you want so that you can move on to the next opportunity that you are going to be more passionate or find interest in or a level of expertise. What I'm getting at is basically the conversations I was having were much more than just the work. And it was a lot more about the relationship that we were building and how we were going to work together for me to meet his needs and for him to meet my needs. And that ultimately helped me get where I'm at now.
And I find it really funny that the managers are usually horribly equipped to have those kinds of conversations. That's not a comfort zone for many people. Just sitting down, finding 15 minutes and having that type of conversation. Not every day, not all the time, but enough. Yeah, it still staggers me that people find themselves ill-equipped for that.
I mentioned as I was kind of talking through that personal values are important when you think about what you want to do throughout your career. In the first conversation, I don't know if you remember this, but I'm sure you've said it to others before. One of your core values is friendship.
Yeah.
What does friendship mean to you, either personally or professionally or both? How did you determine that as a value?
That's a great question. And it is one of my three, the other two being enjoyment and adventure. So why is friendship important to me? I think for a few reasons. One is I am an extrovert, so I know that I get energy from others. So tend to try and gather people. I think from a business standpoint, from our line of business, people do buy what you do, but they also buy who you are. And what I mean by that is, could we put these people in front of our people? So if you think about Amgen, working with the top 350 people, when you are meeting with them and talking about that work, in their mind, they're thinking, oh, could we put Jez and his team in front of our leaders and they would represent us and our brand and do the work that we want them to do? And that requires more than just a competence. Yes, this person's competent and has done this before. They're going to trust you, like you, etc. And that for me is friendship. So I have many, many clients that are friends. Having lunch with one of them tomorrow. And it's not that we meet up at the weekends and go out and our kids all know each other and all that kind of stuff, but we're friends and we would call on each other outside of the work transaction because we have that level of relationship. So that's important to me. And then even when it comes, a lot of people, when you ask them what their values are, they'll talk about family. And I would put family into the friendship bucket as well. So I don't have like a separate value of family. I think that's sort of, if you have a family, then you center yourself around that anyway. But my kids are my friends. We go and ski together. We go hike a mountain together. And that relationship when we're doing those things is one of friends. And it's the same with my wife. My wife's my best friend. I spend a huge amount of time with her. So yeah, it sort of encompasses all of that. My actual friends, my family, and my clients. It's all about friendship. And I know that it's a core value for the absence of it. So when I first moved to New York, for example, I didn't know anybody. I had one client who worked at JP Morgan that I'd met 2 or 3 times before. But apart from that, nobody. I didn't have any friends from back home that had moved to New York, no family hit, nothing. I turned up with a laptop and a suitcase and a corporate apartment. And I knew that was going to be an adventure. So check on that value, right? And I knew I didn't have any friends. And what happened within a couple of weeks was like, I'm not sure I'm enjoying this, right? So 2 of those values were sort of absent. So I remember the moment I moved to the US in 2001. I remember it as clear as day. I was sat at my desk. I'd probably been in the US, I think 2 weeks. And I said to myself, within the next month, I need to throw a party at my apartment with as many people as I can invite. And I can tell you exactly how many people were at that party. There were 32. So within a month of moving to New York, knowing nobody, within that month of making that decision of I need to make friends, I had at least 32 that turned up to my apartment for a party. I know you could say it might be in the free food and drink that I was providing, but all of a sudden I was like, I have friends here. I have people I can talk to and I was relaxed and calm and much more confident and much more myself, and then started to enjoy things. And, so that's how I know they're my values. That's how I figure that stuff out, is because when there's an absence of it, I don't perform very well.
You mentioned that you're an extroverted person. Let's say you're someone that's not. You're introverted. Maybe an ideal party to them is 2 people or 5 people.
Yeah. 3 people at the dinner table. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you just have any advice to someone that is a little terrified of that type of adventure, but maybe they have an opportunity to do something like that or push themselves out of their comfort zone? Any words of wisdom to be successful?
Well, the first point of reflection is to figure out, what are your values? What do you really value? Because if, taking your example of an introvert, they're going to potentially have a different set of values. They may have the same ones. It could potentially be different. But really understanding those, I see this a lot with people switching jobs who are very senior, right? So a friend of mine just moved from one very large investment bank to another very large investment bank, and he'd spent 25 years at this first bank. It was a massive move. What was the number one thing on that person's mind as they were making that quite risky move? Because they knew everybody and everything in this other bank, grown up there pretty much, and just shifting to a new one. The number one thing on their mind wasn't, I'm going to get paid more, or, are there better deals for me to go after? So it was the culture. And so all they were focused on is, what's the culture like of this organization that I'm stepping into? And can I be successful in that culture? Because again, I've met more people than I could count who have been very successful in one organization doing a job, moved to another one to do a very similar job, and been really unsuccessful. And if you ask them why, it will all be to do with the culture of the organization. So for me, if anybody's about to take a big risk, it would be looking at, what are you stepping into? I knew I was stepping into New York. Right. So even though I didn't know anybody in New York, the adventure was entrepreneurial opportunity, establish, build, and grow a business that's social business anyway, with big clients. So I knew I was stepping into that kind of environment. So for me, it's a couple of things. One is, if you're going to take a risk doing something different, what's the environment and the context that you're stepping into? Try and understand that as much as possible, because you've got to know whether it fits you or whether it doesn't. And then a second thing is do some work in understanding what you really value, and to the best of your ability, how will that role, that job, that adventure satisfy your values? And if you can't see it, then it's probably the wrong thing. But if you can see it or you can imagine it, then go for it. And then there are some other obvious things around risk. When you're a lot younger, there's a lot less risk if things don't work out. When you're older, the risk is much, much bigger if things don't work out.
It's good to reflect on oneself to figure out what is important to me now, but what am I maybe a little more open minded to that I never thought of before? And sometimes that can be taking a risk, like moving, to a new place or taking on an adventure that you didn't expect before. Because I also believe that as our life goes on, when you put yourself in a totally new situation, it opens up your perspective. It allows you to reflect on yourself and other life situations in a different way than you had previously. And I'm not suggesting that making a big change, taking a big risk is appropriate for everyone, but especially as a young person, it can be really beneficial to your long-term happiness and
Oh, yeah.
success.
Couple of thoughts on this. One is sort of what excites you. I wouldn't say when I had the opportunity to move to New York and set up the business that I was running for a while, I probably didn't patch it into my values quite that cleanly. It was the opportunity was exciting, and the risk was, for me, relatively low. Now I'm a big risk taker. That's probably the other thing. But, it's sort of what's the worst that could happen? It all goes horribly wrong and I have to figure something out. But when you're young, you have no wife, kids, car, mortgage, this, that, the other. That's really easy to make those big, riskier, what feel risky or sound like a big decision. At the time, didn't really feel that way. So I think it's all a matter of kind of where you're at. And your point about values changing through experiences that you have in life is certainly true for me. I would add to my list now one more around valuing. I would go further than well-being. I would actually say mental health. So for me, over the last 3.5 years, I have come to understand how anxiety and mental health can have a massive impact on you as an individual, just through experiencing it myself, which I'd never really had before. I was a particularly resilient individual. And so that's a big one for me is mental health, resilience, personal well-being, taking the time to really look after yourself. I always thought burnout wasn't a real thing. It's just like, you could run through a brick wall. And that was the young, immature, energetic me.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's something similar to you. I've always found myself to be, a quote unquote strong person who's resilient, who can handle anything, can manage anything. And at the same time, we're all vulnerable to things in life that do affect our mental health, whether we realize it or not. There's someone in my life very close to me that told me recently that they felt like at times I'm acting a bit different than I used to based on something that happened to me earlier this year. That made me really reflect on how do I handle certain things in life and how do they affect my ability to remain resilient and how do they affect the people that I care about. And sometimes it takes some tough love from people. Everyone responds to different things differently. To whoever's listening, ask yourself, what are you vulnerable to? Because that mental health and personal well-being is extremely, extremely important.
Yeah, and resilience is how quickly do you bounce back from those challenges. You can't ignore those or not have them. So, how quickly you bounce back and maintain that kind of level plane. And yeah, that can be a real roller coaster ride. I remember my brother for many years suffered with anxiety. And I had absolutely no empathy for him whatsoever. I was like, come on. And he'd be like, no, I got to retire early. I got to go to the gym every day. I'm now on medication, but just to manage all of that. And I just thought, I don't know what the problem is, just sort of knuckle down. Again, this is the young, exuberant Jez. And only until I had experienced it myself did I have true empathy for him. And it's actually brought us closer together. We lost our dad a couple of years ago. And I remember standing on our dad's driveway chatting, and he just sort of looked at me and said, "How are you doing?" And we don't really chat like that, my brother and I. And it was obvious that he could see that I was struggling because he knows what that looks like and what that feels like. And there's no surprises. There's a mental health crisis in this country right now. Again, people are really struggling to figure out how to be.
It's a journey. It takes a lot of time. It certainly takes a hell of a lot of work. But kudos to anyone that's doing the work to try and figure that stuff out, whether it's in life or what can be secondary to that is career, obviously, which is what we talk about on this show. There's a lot more important
Yeah.
things. I want to switch gears a little bit, Jez. You've alluded to a little bit of your adventurous nature. You started off the show talking about when you were in Pakistan on an expedition tour 30 years ago. But talk a little bit about how you got an adventurous bug put into you. How did you get into mountaineering and the other adventures that I don't even know about you?
Yeah, sure. So I was about 13 years old and I wasn't particularly good at school. At least that's what my teachers told me and my report cards said. And I joined an organization in the UK. It's called the Army Cadet Force. So think Boy Scouts, but sponsored by the British Army. So you got to wear a uniform and you got to learn how to camp out and this, that, and the other. So through the Army Cadets, at the weekends, there were all sorts of trips put on where you would go hiking in the hills in England. And yes, there are hills and mountains in England and Scotland and Wales. So I joined this youth organization. Every now and again, we would go away and hike and camp. And I would just find myself at the top of the mountain or the hill before everybody else. Or I would find myself carrying somebody else's bag because they were struggling. I would find myself, enjoying things when everybody else looked miserable and in pain. So I just had this natural ability to put a bag on my back and walk uphill. And I'm being dead honest here. It was pretty much the only thing I was good at when I was a teenager. And I think when you find something that you're good at least in my case, you just do more of it because it's enjoyable and it's fun and it's adventurous. So I just went from climbing hills in England to climbing mountains in Wales to climbing bigger mountains in Europe, in the Alps, to getting qualified as a mountain guide and leading expeditions in North Africa. So yeah, it was an evolution of finding something that I was good at. And I guess if you're a good distance runner, your aim might be to run a marathon or an ultra marathon or whatever it is. You're always looking for what's the next thing. And I think in mountaineering, there's a very obvious one, that's Everest. So a lot of people aspire to climb Everest. So for me, it was a big ambition of mine ever since I was 13 years old. You can look at some of my school projects and they'll be about Everest and people who climbed Everest and my research on mountaineers from Austria and all that kind of crazy stuff. So yeah, anything in the mountains. So that can now be backcountry. I'm a snowboarder, so I have a split board and I skin up the mountains backcountry and snowboard off to some heliboarding to dragging my 10-year-old up hills to go camping at the weekends because he's into it now. And yeah, so that's my history. So I climbed Everest in 2005. In 2004, I climbed the sixth highest mountain in the world, which is called Choyoyu. That trip in Pakistan, we had a first ascent. So it was a peak in the Hindu Kush Himalaya that had never been climbed before. Myself, Baz, my other expedition leader, and one of the students on that trip made a first ascent while we were there. So yeah, it's just always been a huge passion for me where I feel at home and comfortable and relaxed. And
Any major mountains that you've got your eye on for sometime soon?
yeah, sometime soon is an interesting one with the kids I have my age. Big mountains take a long time. So Everest was 61 nights in a tent. People are like, seriously? I thought it was like 2 weeks. Yeah, no, 61 nights in a tent, 2 months. So that trip, all in all, was probably 10 weeks by the time you get there and get back. So finding that kind of time at the moment is tough. But on the bright side, there are a few mountains like Denali in Alaska, which is 3 weeks. It's a 21-day all in that has been on my bucket list for a while. And then as my youngest guy gets a bit older, there's some stuff up in New Hampshire that he wants to do with me that I've done, but we can do it together and have that kind of father-son experience. But big mountain, probably Denali is on my list as something I want to do sooner rather than later.
Amazing. So cool. And I know that obviously is directly related to your own podcast, Route to the Top.
Yeah, that's right.
Tell me and the audience a little more about Route to the Top. How did it get started? And what do you talk about? Who's it with on the show?
Yeah, that's right. Now, is it route to the top or route to the top? So that's the English US interchange of the same word. But yeah, so it all came about when I set up Canvas. Again, this was 3.5 years ago. I really was looking for a way to differentiate ourselves from a marketing standpoint, not from a what we do and how we do it. We were already looking at how to differentiate ourselves in the market from our competitors. But when you look at our competitors, people like Korn Ferry or BTS or Center for Creative Leadership, whoever it might be, they all look the same. And what I mean by that is if you read any of their things on LinkedIn and scrubbed the name off of it, it could have been written by any of them. And it's usually, we researched and interviewed, 50 CEOs and they told us blah, blah, blah. And oh, guess what? That's what we do as a company. And so it was all just like very samey, not particularly inspirational, not that interesting to look at, etc. So that exists in our marketplace and it still hasn't changed. It's still exactly the same. Our latest behavioral scientist has decided, XYZ. Our work, and certainly my work personally with Canvas or any of the firms I've worked with previously, has always been about the practical application of that stuff. It's like, okay, that's great research and that's all very cognitive and thanks very much. But in reality, this is a leader in a company, in a context, trying to achieve something. So how do they need to be leading? And it throws out all of that research because contextually, it's different to this. So the problem with research is it's not contextual in the slightest. It just boils things down into some traits of leadership or whatever. So it was like, okay, I've got to find something that's different, that differentiates us purely from a marketing standpoint. A couple of my friends are doing podcasts and for different businesses, one running an investor relations company and another think tank business. And I started to listen to them. I was like, I like this, good people to interview and all the rest of it. So that starts to trigger, maybe I should do a podcast. And then I listened to my friend who's in investor relations, and his podcast was called Welcome to the Arena. And it's audio only, but he creates in your mind with that name. His name's Tom Ryan, by the way. Welcome to the Arena, another good podcast. He creates in your mind him and this other person in an arena, kind of duking it out, having a really good sparring kind of conversation. And I was like, yeah, I need a location. I need to create a place. And then another friend of mine sent me somebody else's podcast, which was called Podcast from My Shed. And he would literally hold his podcast. His studio was his garden shed. And he would invite guests in and they'd do it in the shed together. And his first question was like, so do you have a shed at home? And if so, what do you keep in it? Or you have a garage? Or, it was just sort of, but it's like, oh yeah, you could hear it and see it. And so I was like, what would be my location? And of course, the answer came very, very quickly, which was, it's got to be in the mountains. And then from there, it went from, well, if it's going to be in the mountains, it should probably be a video podcast, not an audio one, because you want the views and to see that. And then you obviously can't interview on the way up because you're kind of walking and climbing and all the rest of it. So we would talk about what we're going to talk about in the interview on the way up and then do the interview from the summit of whatever that mountain is. And then the name came, its original name was View from the Top. And then a very good friend of mine who is a wizard on the marketing side of things and communication side of things said, no, View from the Top is a short story, but their route to the top or their route to the top is a much more interesting, longer story. So that's what you should be interviewing them about, is how they got from where they started in their lives to being the CEO of X, Y, and Z company. So that's where it came from. And to my surprise, there have been no shortage of people, CEOs whose time is pretty valuable, who will quite happily take a couple of days off and go climb something with me and then be interviewed from the top. I've been to Iceland. I've done a lot in Colorado, Wyoming, the UK, so finding people, clients to come on that journey and do that podcast has been fabulous. And It just makes for a real natural interview because we're kind of sweaty and been hiking all day and there's no, the flies are bugging us or whatever. There's no pretense, there's no makeup and microphones and all that sort of stuff. And that has just been and made for some really great conversations. So yeah, that's Route to the Top. I think there's 12 episodes with some really interesting interviewees.
I love it. And I've listened to a few of the episodes and they're so interesting. First off, I think the fact that it is just, we're setting up a camera on top of a mountain. There's elements.
Yeah.
I think the interview you had with the CHRO of Netflix, you moved that inside in a spa or in a hut of some sort because the weather wasn't good. I actually find that part of the fascination to watch or listen, because similarly to Route to the Top versus View from the Top, it opens up a human element to this. Like, yeah, we all want to say we want to climb a mountain or we want to see the view from the top, right? Because it's beautiful. But you kind of forget how you got up there. Kudos to you on a great show.
Yeah, thank you. I've loved it. And if you want to click into a couple of those real human stories, the one with David Tate, he's the CEO of the World Gold Council, which nobody's ever heard of. An amazing individual and an amazing journey. In fact, there's a movie that's been made about his life now. And we actually summited Everest together.
Wow.
10 minutes apart from each other.
Wow.
That's an amazing episode, I think. I like all of them all for very different reasons, but that one is a real human story being told. And yeah, he's an amazing guy. So yeah, but it's been fun. And I got a couple more episodes out there, a couple more guests, and then, looking for a couple more. So if anybody's listening to this, fancies a Route to the Top episode, reach out.
Definitely. And where can folks find Route to the Top?
Probably the easiest way, it's on all channels. So it's on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on YouTube. So they're probably the three easiest ways of finding it, all on video. People are like, oh, you can do a video podcast on Spotify? It's like, yep, you can. And if you just search Jez Benton, is probably actually the easiest search. Because I think if you search Route to the Top, a few other things will pop up with my name on that. That's probably the easiest way to search for it and to find it.
Awesome. And Jez, if anyone wants to learn more about you or get in touch with you in some way, where can they find you?
Easiest thing is my email address, which is jez.benton, BENTON, @canvasleadership.com. That's my direct email. Doesn't get filtered by anybody or anything. I read all of my emails and reply to all of my emails, not always in a timely manner, but I do get to them all. So yeah, that's probably the easiest way to get in touch. Our website, canvasleadership.com, talks about who we are and what we do and the clients that we work with as well.
Amazing. Well, Jez, I want to thank you for being on the show. Such an interesting life and career journey to share. I've definitely enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much, my friend.
More than welcome. It's been great. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Career Focus. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that follow button or leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or drop a comment on YouTube. You also can find snippets from episodes and more on the show's Instagram, which is Career Focus Pod. Your feedback means a lot and helps us grow. Catch you next time.